In mid-1943, the war in the Pacific had entered a transitional phase. The rapid Japanese advance of 1941 to 1942 had been halted, and the battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal had shifted the strategic balance. Japan still possessed large forces in the Central and Southwest Pacific, including more than 100,000 personnel in the base complex around Rabaul on New Britain, but its ability to sustain offensive operations was declining. The United States and its allies, drawing on increasing industrial output and expanding carrier and amphibious fleets, were beginning a methodical advance toward the Japanese defensive perimeter. In the South Pacific, control of the Solomon Islands chain became a central objective for both sides. The southern part of the chain, including Guadalcanal, had seen continuous fighting since August 1942. After the evacuation of the last Japanese forces from Guadalcanal in February 1943, the front shifted northwestward toward the Central Solomons. There, New Georgia, Columbangara, and the surrounding smaller islands formed a barrier between Allied bases in the southern Solomons and the major Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. Whoever controlled these islands could project air and naval power deep into the Bismarck Sea and the Coral Sea. New Georgia contains several key airfield sites, particularly the airstrip at Munda on the island's southwest coast. Japanese engineers and construction units had begun developing this airfield in 1942 in order to support operations over Guadalcanal and to secure a stepping stone toward the New Hebrides and Fiji. By mid-1943, approximately 10,000 Japanese Army and Navy troops, including combat units of the 13th Infantry Regiment, naval landing forces, and base personnel, were deployed across New Georgia and nearby islands. Their supply line ran by sea from Rabaul and Bougainville down the narrow channels between the islands, a route that Allied personnel called the Slot. The United States, coordinating with Australian and New Zealand forces under the South Pacific Area Command, sought to neutralize the Japanese base system around Rabaul through a series of limited offensives rather than a direct assault. This strategy, later known as Operation Cartwheel, combined land advances in New Guinea with amphibious operations in the Solomons. The seizure of New Georgia was one component within this wider plan. For American planners, capturing Munda Airfield and adjacent anchorages would allow medium bombers and fighters to operate closer to Rabaul and would reduce the effectiveness of Japanese air attacks on Allied shipping. The geography of the Central Solomons shaped all subsequent naval operations. Kula Gulf, the body of water that would give its name to the battle, lay between the northern coast of New Georgia and the southern shore of Columbangara, opening to the northwest toward the open sea. The Gulf was ringed by steep jungle-covered slopes with few developed ports. Narrow passages linked it to adjacent waters, to the southeast via Kula and New Georgia Sounds, and to the northwest toward Vela Gulf and Bougainville. At night, with minimal shore lighting, these channels became dark corridors in which fast warships and transports could move with limited risk of detection from the air. To maintain their garrisons, Japanese commanders relied on high-speed night transport missions that Allied forces labeled the Tokyo Express. Destroyers and light cruisers, often operating from bases at Rabaul and the Shortland Islands, ran down the slot, carrying troops, ammunition, and supplies. Cargo was loaded in drums or crates that could be quickly offloaded into barges or dumped overboard to be collected near shore. These runs had supported Japanese forces on Guadalcanal and continued to supply New Georgia and Columbangara. They depended on speed, training in night combat, and the range of the Type 93 oxygen-fueled torpedo, known to the Allies as the Long Lance. Opposing them, the United States Navy built up cruiser-destroyer task groups based at Tulagi and Purvis Bay near Guadalcanal. By July 1943, the South Pacific Force under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey could deploy multiple groups centered on modern light cruisers such as Helena, Honolulu, and St. Louis, escorted by destroyer divisions equipped with surface search radar. American doctrine emphasized radar-directed gunnery at night, using SG radar sets to detect enemy ships at ranges beyond visual sighting. Crews trained to bring multiple 6-inch and 5-inch batteries to bear within minutes of contact, aiming to overwhelm enemy ships before they could close to torpedo range. Intelligence assessments on both sides were incomplete. Allied codebreakers at times gained advance notice of Japanese reinforcement missions, including approximate sailing dates and destinations, but could not always determine the exact strength or composition of each convoy. Pilots from reconnaissance squadrons based on Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands flew regular searches over the Central Solomons, yet weather, cloud cover, and the limited number of available aircraft left gaps. Japanese staff officers, for their part, knew that Allied surface forces and aircraft operated from the southeast, but often underestimated the effectiveness of American radar and overestimated the ability of their own night-fighting tactics to offset growing Allied strength. Public sentiment at home reflected these strategic changes. In Japan, news of withdrawals from Guadalcanal and defeats in the Bismarck Sea was presented in controlled terms, and the population was encouraged to view the struggle in the Solomons as a defensive battle to protect the empire. In the United States, the costly victories of 1942 and early 1943 were framed as proof that the Navy and Marine Corps could push steadily across the Pacific, though the high casualties in jungle fighting and naval actions tempered expectations of rapid success. By early July 1943, both societies were committed to campaigns whose details were largely unknown to civilians, but whose outcomes would shape the next phase of the war. Within this broader context, the planned American landings on New Georgia at the end of June 1943 and the Japanese decision to reinforce their garrisons set the stage for a series of night naval engagements in and around Kula Gulf. The ships that would soon confront each other, there were not isolated units but instruments of wider operational plans, shaped by geography, logistics, and the cumulative experience of nearly 2 years of war at sea. On 30 June 1943, United States forces began landings on New Georgia at several points along the southern and central coasts. Elements of the 43rd Infantry Division, supported by Marines and naval construction units, came ashore near Rendova and other staging areas. Their immediate objective was to establish artillery positions and supply dumps within range of Munda Airfield. Japanese coastal observers and air units detected these movements and reported that a substantial amphibious operation was underway, indicating an Allied attempt to secure control of Central Solomons airfields. At Rabaul, headquarters of the Japanese 8th Fleet and 11th Air Fleet, staff officers assessed the New Georgia landings as a threat to the broader defensive line protecting Bougainville and the approaches to the Bismarck Sea. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, responsible for overall air operations, and Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding 8th Fleet, concluded that the garrisons on New Georgia and nearby islands would have to be reinforced and supplied if they were to delay or disrupt the Allied advance. Orders were issued to organize a series of high-speed reinforcement runs down the slot, using destroyers and light cruisers to transport troops and material into the Central Solomons. The first significant reinforcement movements in this series converged on Kula Gulf in the night of 30 June to 1st July. Japanese destroyers, loaded with approximately 1,200 troops and equipment, entered the Gulf and landed personnel on New Georgia and Kolombangara under cover of darkness. These missions encountered limited interference, reinforcing the belief among some Japanese officers that the Tokyo Express could still operate effectively despite growing Allied air and naval strength. However, submarine sightings and reconnaissance reports allowed American commanders to infer that further runs were likely. On Guadalcanal and in the Russell Islands, the American South Pacific Command adjusted its naval deployments. Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth, flying his flag in the light cruiser Honolulu, was given tactical command of a cruiser-destroyer group designated Task Group 36.1. This force initially centered on 3 Brooklyn-class light cruisers, Helena, Honolulu, and St. Louis, each mounting 15 6-inch guns, supported by multiple destroyers divided into van and rear divisions. Ainsworth's mission was to intercept and, if possible, disrupt Japanese reinforcement efforts into the New Georgia area while avoiding excessive risk to his own ships. As reports arrived of fresh Japanese movements toward the Central Solomons, staff at Halsey's South Pacific headquarters used a combination of signals, intelligence, and air reconnaissance to estimate likely routes and timings. Intercepts of Japanese naval communications suggested preparations for additional runs into Kula Gulf and Vila on Kolombangara. Search aircraft from squadrons based at Henderson Field and the Russells attempted to shadow enemy forces during daylight, but the Japanese generally scheduled their approach so as to pass key points under cloud cover or after sunset. The result was an operational pattern in which each side entered night actions with partial and sometimes inaccurate information about the exact composition and position of the opposing force. By the first days of July, the tactical geography around Kula Gulf had begun to fill with Allied staging areas and Japanese forward positions. On New Georgia, American infantry units were pushing inland from their beachheads through dense jungle toward Munda, while artillery batteries emplaced on nearby islands fired across narrow channels at Japanese positions. On Kolombangara, Japanese engineers continued work on air and naval facilities around Vila, and barge units operated between small anchorages to distribute supplies landed by destroyers. Shore-based radar was limited, so both navies still relied heavily on shipborne sensors and visual lookouts once their forces entered the restricted waters of the Gulf. Command structures on each side reflected different organizational traditions. Ainsworth, as a cruiser officer trained in gunnery, placed emphasis on coordinated salvos controlled by radar ranging and fire control systems. His destroyers, under division leaders such as Commander Francis X. McInerney, were expected to screen ahead and on the flanks, providing both early warning and torpedo fire when ordered. On the Japanese side, Rear Admiral Teruo Akiyama, an officer with experience in destroyer operations, was assigned to lead a reinforcement force composed largely of modern destroyers, including ships of the Yugumo and Kagero classes, some equipped with Type 22 surface search radar, but all relying primarily on optical instruments and torpedo tactics developed in pre-war training. Civilians in the immediate area of operations were few, but the indigenous populations of New Georgia, Kolombangara, and nearby islands were affected by both sides' preparations. Local labor was used by Japanese forces to construct defenses and airfield facilities, while Allied coast watchers, many of them colonial officials or planters working with Solomon Islanders, reported ship movements and air activity to Guadalcanal by radio. These Coast Watch stations formed part of the intelligence framework that fed into decisions about when and where to send surface groups like Ainsworth's into contested waters. In Tokyo and Washington, the opening phase of the New Georgia campaign and the associated naval actions in Kula Gulf attracted less attention than larger operations elsewhere, but they were monitored by naval staff who followed loss reports and assessed trends in night combat. Japanese planners hoped that their trained night fighting crews and long-lance torpedoes would continue to offset Allied numerical and material growth. American analysts examined after-action reports from earlier battles around Guadalcanal, noting both successes and instances in which radar advantages had been squandered by poor coordination or misinterpretation of contacts. By the evening of July 5, 1943, the pattern set in motion by these decisions converged on a specific configuration. Akiyama's reinforcement group, carrying Army troops intended for New Georgia, departed the northern bases and moved down the slot toward Kula Gulf. Simultaneously, Ainsworth's task group, 36.1, alerted by intelligence of impending enemy movement, sortied from the south to intercept. Both forces entered the approaches to Kula Gulf under cover of darkness, each commanded by officers confident in their doctrine, but working with incomplete information about the other side. The opening phase of what would be known as the Battle of Kula Gulf was about to begin, shaped by months of earlier campaigns and by the immediate demands of the New Georgia operation. Strategic planning for the coming night in Kula Gulf took place within the larger framework of Operation Cartwheel. For the United States, the New Georgia operations were designed to bring air power steadily closer to Rabaul without incurring the losses expected from a direct assault on that base. Capturing Munda Airfield and denying the Japanese reliable reinforcement routes via Kolombangara were specific objectives. Naval actions such as the forthcoming engagement in Kula Gulf were thus planned as supporting operations. Their purpose was not only to sink enemy ships, but to prevent additional troops and supplies from reaching the battlefields around Munda and Bairoko. Japanese planners framed their goals in inverse terms. Holding the Central Solomons, and especially the chain, running from Bougainville through Kolombangara and New Georgia, was seen as essential to shielding Rabaul and maintaining a forward line from which air and naval forces could threaten Allied advances. The reinforcement convoys into Vila on Kolombangara were intended to deliver infantry and materiel that could be moved by barge and small craft to Munda and other positions on New Georgia. The specific convoy Akiyama was to lead into Kula Gulf on the night of July the 5th to 6th, carried about 2,600 Army troops and roughly 90 tons of supplies, a portion of which planners intended to forward toward the Munda sector within days. On the American side, Rear Admiral Ainsworth and his staff developed a battle plan that concentrated on radar-directed gunnery. Task Group 36.1, built around the light cruisers Honolulu, St. Louis, and Helena, with 4 destroyers as screen, was to approach Kula Gulf in column. Destroyers Nicholas and O'Bannon formed the van, with Radford and Jenkins in the rear. The concept called for the van destroyers to make initial radar contact, with the cruisers opening fire at medium ranges as soon as a stable solution was obtained. Torpedo use by the American destroyers was not entirely neglected, but in planning documents, gunnery remained the primary offensive tool. Ainsworth expected to achieve results by bringing concentrated 6-inch and 5-inch gunfire to bear rapidly on any detected targets. Japanese planning gave primacy to torpedoes. Akiyama's reinforcement force consisted of 10 destroyers grouped into a support unit and 2 transport units. The support unit, with Niizuki as flagship and Suzukaze and Tanikaze as consorts, was to form the Fighting Corps, equipped with surface search equipment and carrying batteries of Type 93 torpedoes. The transport divisions, including Amagiri, Hatsuyuki, Nagatsuki, Satsuki, Mochizuki, Mikazuki, and Hamikaze, embarked troops and supplies. Their doctrine called for the escort group to engage any interfering Allied surface force, ideally by launching torpedoes from long range under cover of night, while the transports either continued to Vila or withdrew behind smokescreens as the situation required. Logistical considerations influenced both plans. For the United States, the availability of flashless powder was an important factor in night gunnery. Helena, which had bombarded Vila and Barocco the night before, had expended much of her flashless propellant and would have to fire with standard smokeless powder if engaged again. This was known to Ainsworth before he sailed, yet the ship was retained in the formation because of her powerful main battery and experienced crew. American destroyers carried limited torpedo reloads and fuel, so the task group was expected to fight one short engagement and then withdraw to the southeast rather than remain on station through successive nights. Japanese logisticians faced different constraints. The number of destroyers available for transport duty was finite, and each hull taken for the Tokyo Express was one less available for fleet escort or other missions. Fuel stocks at Rabaul and the Shortlands were under pressure from continuous operations. To reduce exposure to Allied air attack, the plan called for destroyers to run the slot at high speed by night, unload or disembark troops near Vila in compressed time windows, and immediately withdraw before daylight. As a result, Japanese officers accepted relatively tight scheduling and limited margin for on-scene improvisation. The convoys had to arrive and depart according to calculations that balance fuel consumption, unloading rates, and sunrise times. Each side entered the battle with assumptions that framed its planning. American commanders expected the Japanese to send 3 to 6 destroyers on reinforcement duty, a figure derived from earlier convoys, and did not fully anticipate facing 10. There was confidence that SG radar would detect any enemy force in time to deploy the column effectively, and that trained plotting teams could distinguish real contacts from echoes or land clutter in the confined waters of Kula Gulf. Japanese commanders, conversely, assumed that their destroyer crews' superior training in night fighting and the range of the Type 93 torpedo would compensate for Allied radar. Torpedo salvos were expected to break up or cripple an opposing formation before gunfire could inflict decisive damage. Propaganda and public information did not drive these specific plans, but they formed a background consideration. In Japan, reinforcing New Georgia and maintaining a presence in the Central Solomons could be presented as evidence that the Imperial Navy remained capable of contesting the seas around the empire. In the United States, the continuing offensive into the Solomons was framed in public statements as part of a larger strategy to push back toward the Philippines and beyond. Though individual night actions like those in Kula Gulf were rarely described in detail until after the fact, staff officers on both sides were aware that cumulative results, rather than any single battle, would shape these narratives. Finally, the coordination between land and naval operations shaped immediate planning. American landings at Rice Anchorage on the north coast of New Georgia were timed with naval bombardments and surface sweeps to disrupt Japanese barge traffic and reinforcement routes via Kolombangara. Japanese staff sought to synchronize their destroyer runs with the expected pace of ground fighting, moving units southward in increments that could be absorbed and employed by commanders around Munda and Baroko. In the hours before contact in Kula Gulf, both navies believed that effective planning and doctrine would allow them to support their respective ground forces and limit the opponent's freedom of movement in the Central Solomons. Shortly before midnight on July 5, 1943, the Central Solomons lay under low cloud with intermittent rain squalls, conditions that favored night movements by surface ships. Ainsworth's task group, 36.1, advanced northwest along New Georgia Sound in a single column at roughly 25 knots. Nicholas and O'Bannon led, followed by the light cruisers Helena, Honolulu, and St. Louis, with Radford and Jenkins in the rear. Gunnery crews stood by their 6-inch and 5-inch batteries. Radar operators monitored SG and FC sets, and plotting rooms prepared to convert electronic contacts into firing solutions as soon as any enemy ships appeared on their screens. From the opposite direction, Akiyama's destroyer force moved down the slot toward Kula Gulf. Niyazuki, carrying the flag, led Suzukaze and Tanikaze as the support group. Behind them sailed the transport divisions, Amagiri, Hatsuyuki, and Nagatsuki in one group, Satsuki, Mochizuki, Mikazuki, and Hamikaze in another. Together they carried approximately 2,600 soldiers of Japanese army units and several dozen tons of ammunition, rations, and equipment stored in drums and crates on deck. The plan called for the support group to shield the transports while they entered the Gulf, and then to engage any Allied force that attempted interception. Shortly before 0140 on June 6th, as the American column approached the entrance to Kula Gulf, SG radar operators on the van destroyers reported contacts at long range bearing roughly northwest. Initial plots indicated several ships moving southeast at moderate speed. Ainsworth ordered course adjustments to bring his column onto a nearly converging track. At the same time, lookouts scanned the dark horizon for silhouettes or muzzle flashes, but the first indications remained the green and orange traces on radar repeaters in the cruiser plotting rooms. Reports were passed by voice tube and sound-powered telephone to the bridges and combat information centers. On Niyazuki, equipped with Type 22 surface search radar, Japanese operators also detected contacts. Their sets, though less precise than American SG radar, gave approximate range and bearing. Akiyama received reports that multiple ships were approaching from the southeast, consistent with the presence of an Allied surface group. In accordance with doctrine, he directed the transport divisions to continue toward Vila at high speed, while the support group prepared to engage. The Japanese column altered course slightly to gain a favorable torpedo firing position, seeking to cross ahead of the American approach. As range closed to under 20,000 yards, Ainsworth's staff confirmed that the contacts represented at least several enemy destroyers. At approximately 1:57, he ordered his cruisers to open fire when ready on the leading targets, using radar ranges and bearings. Within minutes, Helena, Honolulu, and St. Louis began firing rapid salvos of 6-inch shells, their guns trained by directors slaved to radar. Helena, whose crew had extensive experience in night bombardments, increased her rate of fire to a level that produced a nearly continuous stream of shells toward the primary contact, assessed as Niyazuki. The opening salvos caught the Japanese support group as it maneuvered to launch torpedoes. Shells from the American cruisers straddled and then hit Niyazuki, knocking out communications equipment and starting fires amidships. Fragments and near misses affected crew performance, but Japanese torpedo officers continued to work their calculations. Suzukaze and Tanakaze laid smoke and altered course, both to complicate American fire control and to position themselves for torpedo attacks. The destroyers in the transport divisions, alerted by radio, began evasive movements while maintaining their general track toward Kolombangara. Despite being under fire, the Japanese destroyers succeeded in launching multiple salvos of Type 93 torpedoes. From the support group alone, more than a dozen torpedoes entered the water in quick succession, set for long-range runs at depths calculated to intersect the American column. Additional torpedoes were fired by some of the transport destroyers once they perceived the engagement developing behind them. The weapons ran silently at high speed, leaving little visible wake in the dark waters of Kula Gulf. On the American ships, the opening minutes of the engagement appeared to validate expectations about radar-directed gunnery. Plotting rooms reported decreasing ranges and solid target tracks. Observers believed they saw hits on at least one enemy vessel, with changes in radar echo strength interpreted as evidence of damage. Ainsworth maintained his column formation and continued to drive northwest, seeking to close the range further in order to increase the accuracy and effect of his cruiser's gunfire. The destroyers Nicholas and O'Bannon were instructed to hold their torpedoes in reserve until a clearer picture of enemy movements emerged. For Japanese crews, the first phase of the battle was experienced mainly as shock from gunfire impacts and the disciplined execution of torpedo procedures under fire. Damage control parties on Niizuki moved to contain fires and flooding, while bridge personnel attempted to maintain station and heading. On Suzukaze and Tanakaze, officers sought to judge the fall of American shot and adjust course accordingly, using both optical instruments and limited radar information. The transport destroyers, carrying troops crowded on decks and below, had to balance the need for evasive action against the risk of collisions or accidental loss of personnel overboard in the darkness. In the waters between the two columns, the torpedoes already underway formed an unseen threat that neither side could track precisely. American radar could detect ships but not torpedoes, and visual lookouts would have only seconds of warning if they noticed wakes or phosphorescence. As the opening exchanges of gunfire continued, both formations remained on generally converging courses, setting the conditions for the next phase of the engagement in which those torpedoes would reach the vicinity of Ainsworth's cruisers and destroyers. As the American column pressed deeper into Kula Gulf, the engagement entered a more chaotic phase. Around 2:03, radar operators and lookouts on the cruisers and destroyers began reporting indistinct flashes and temporary loss of target definition, caused by smoke, rain, and land echoes from the steep shores of New Georgia and Kolombangara. The precision that had characterized the opening minutes gave way to a more fragmented picture. Ainsworth still believed his formation held the initiative through concentrated gunnery, but the longer the column remained on a steady course, the more it became exposed to the unseen torpedo salvos already running in the water. At approximately 2:13, Helena, positioned just behind Nicholas and O'Bannon, was struck on her starboard side by one of the Type 93 torpedoes. The explosion broke the hull structure forward of the second funnel, flooding compartments and knocking out power to forward turrets and electrical systems. Within minutes, 2 additional torpedoes hit further along the hull. The cumulative damage caused major structural failure amidships, and the cruiser began to break apart. Crew members in affected sections experienced a rapid sequence of shock, darkness, and flooding as bulkheads collapsed and machinery foundations gave way. The torpedo hits on Helena marked a critical moment for Task Group 36.1. From the bridges of Honolulu and St. Louis, the first indication was a bright flash and rising column of water in the darkness astern of the van destroyers, followed by radio reports that Helena had lost power and was coming to a stop. Ainsworth now faced a dilemma common in night actions, whether to maintain offensive pressure or to break off in order to avoid further torpedo exposure and to assist a damaged ship. He chose to turn his remaining cruisers and destroyers away to the southeast, simultaneously ordering search and rescue preparations, while keeping guns ready to engage any pursuing enemy vessels. On the Japanese side, The period immediately following the torpedo impacts brought both opportunity and difficulty. Niizuki, us already under severe gunfire, suffered additional hits that disabled propulsion and fire control. At some point during this phase, she lost the ability to maneuver and was fatally damaged, with many crew members killed at their stations. Suzukaze and Tanikaze, less heavily hit, attempted to close the range and exploit the confusion among the American ships, but they also had to avoid collision with friendly vessels and with drifting wreckage. Their captains reported by radio that torpedo salvos had been fired and that at least one large enemy ship appeared to be disabled. The transport destroyers, still carrying troops intended for New Georgia, experienced the escalation primarily as a series of abrupt course changes, gunfire flashes on the horizon, and intermittent orders to increase or reduce speed. Some ships, including Nagatsuki, became separated from the main body while maneuvering in the confined waters off New Georgia. The need to avoid grounding on reefs and shoals along the coast further complicated navigation. Commanders of these transports had to weigh the original mission of delivering troops to Vila against the risk of remaining within range of Allied surface forces that might regroup and counterattack. Weather and terrain influenced these decisions. Rain squalls passing over the Gulf periodically reduced visibility to a few thousand yards, masking both friend and foe. The steep coastlines created radar shadows and clutter that could conceal individual ships at certain bearings. For American operators, echoes from land sometimes merged with or obscured smaller Japanese destroyer contacts. For Japanese officers without equivalent radar capability, the combination of darkness, landmasses, and smoke made it difficult to maintain formation alignment and to track the movements of Ainsworth's withdrawing ships. Communication challenges intensified the crisis on both sides. On Helena, internal communications were disrupted as power failed and compartments flooded, forcing surviving officers and enlisted men to relay orders by messenger and shouted instructions. On other American ships, radio circuits carried simultaneous traffic about enemy contacts, maneuver orders, and calls for assistance to Helena, increasing the risk of misinterpretation. Japanese wireless operators likewise struggled with congestion and interference as multiple destroyers transmitted contact reports and status messages while trying to maintain radio silence as far as possible to avoid aiding Allied direction finding. Politically, the outcome of such night battles had implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. Within the Japanese command structure, each reinforcement run that failed to reach its destination contributed to questions about the sustainability of the Central Solomons defensive line, yet the loss of destroyers in surface combat also eroded the overall strength of the fleet. For the United States, the sinking or disablement of modern cruisers like Helena represented a significant material cost, but success in preventing reinforcements from reaching New Georgia would support the longer-term objective of advancing toward Rabaul. These considerations were present in staff evaluations, even though individual ship commanders were focused on immediate survival and mission execution. As the engagement extended past 0220, elements of both forces found themselves in dispersed positions. Some Japanese destroyers continued northward or westward in accordance with earlier orders. Others turned back up the slot, and at least one moved toward damaged or stranded units along the coast. Ainsworth's group, now oriented to the southeast, prepared to send destroyers back toward the position where Helena had been last seen, in order to recover survivors if enemy activity allowed. The battle had escalated from an initial radar-directed intercept into a multi-directional crisis involving damage control, rescue efforts, and the risk of renewed contact in an environment still shaped by the presence of additional torpedoes and by the limited visibility of the Central Solomons night. The period from approximately 2:20 to dawn on June 6, 1943, formed the most intense phase of the action around Kula Gulf. Helena, fatally damaged by 3 torpedo hits, began to lose structural integrity as flooding increased and longitudinal strength failed. The hull broke into sections, forward compartments flooded rapidly, and the bow portion separated and sank. The remaining structure, including parts of the superstructure and aft turrets, stayed afloat for a limited time, giving some crew members the opportunity to reach life rafts, floater nets, and debris. Others were trapped in flooded spaces or injured by collapsing equipment. On the surface, the sea around the wreck was dotted with small groups of survivors. They faced several immediate hazards: oil on the water, loose wreckage, and the possibility of further explosions from ammunition or fuel. Some rafts drifted toward the open Gulf, others toward the coasts of New Georgia and Vella Lavella. Officers and petty officers in the water tried to maintain group cohesion, counting heads and organizing those who could swim or assist the injured. Estimates later indicated that of roughly 900 personnel aboard before the battle, more than 150 were lost in the sinking or in the hours immediately following it, while several hundred remained dispersed in the vicinity. Ainsworth, having turned his main body to the southeast, ordered Nicholas and Radford to reverse course and return toward the position where Helena had gone down. Bannon and Jenkins were directed to remain with the cruisers to guard against renewed contact. As Nicholas and Radford closed the area, their crews shifted from combat routines to rescue operations, while maintaining readiness for surface engagement. Lookouts were tasked with spotting men in the water. Signalmen prepared searchlights, and small boat crews stood by. The destroyers had to move at low speed and alter course frequently to avoid survivors and floating wreckage, all while remaining within a zone that could be reached by Japanese ships or additional torpedoes. Japanese forces were also experiencing their peak strain. Niizuki, heavily hit by American gunfire, lost propulsion and steering. Fires and explosions gradually rendered the ship untenable. At some point after 2:30, she sank, taking with her a substantial portion of her crew and Rear Admiral Akiyama. Exact casualty figures vary, but several hundred personnel are estimated to have been lost with the ship. Suzukaze and Tanikaze, though damaged to varying degrees by near misses and splinters, retained enough mobility to withdraw northward and later rejoin other elements of the force. Their crews balanced damage control with the need to remain ready for possible re-engagement. The transport destroyers experienced divergent fates. Some, including Satsuki, Mochizuki, Mikazuki, and Hamikaze, succeeded in landing a portion of their embarked troops near Vila on Kolombangara, either during the night or shortly afterward. Approximately 1,300 to 1,500 soldiers ultimately reached shore from this convoy, adding to the Japanese garrison in the area. Nagatsuki, maneuvering close to the New Georgia coast in poor visibility, ran aground near Bairoko. Attempts to refloat her failed, and she remained stranded in shallow water. Her crew began removing equipment and preparing for possible air attack at first light. For the American sailors engaged in rescue operations, the peak of the crisis combined humanitarian and tactical considerations. Nicholas and Radford illuminated patches of water with searchlights, while keeping guns trained outward in case Japanese destroyers reappeared. They recovered several hundred Helena survivors during the remaining hours of darkness, bringing men aboard via scrambling nets and boats. In some cases, decisions had to be made about how long to remain in a given area before moving on, given the finite time before daylight and the risk of enemy aircraft once the sun rose. The need to maintain maneuverability limited how close the destroyers could come to certain concentrations of debris. On land, the most intense naval phase overlapped with ongoing ground operations. American forces at Rice Anchorage landed shortly before the battle, were consolidating positions on the north coast of New Georgia and preparing to move inland. Japanese troops landed from the destroyer convoy would, in the following days, filter toward New Georgia through barge traffic and overland routes. Although these soldiers did not participate directly in the naval engagement, their movement was a central reason for the battle, linking the peak of the night fighting at sea with the broader struggle for control of Munda and surrounding areas. Civilian presence near the peak of the combat remained limited but not absent. Coastal villages on Kolombangara and New Georgia could hear gunfire and see flashes on the horizon. Some inhabitants were employed by Japanese military units as laborers or guides, while others maintained contact with Allied coast watchers. The sinking of large ships and the beaching of Nagatsuki left physical traces such as wreckage, oil, and occasional bodies along shorelines that local communities would encounter in subsequent days. These populations were drawn indirectly into the intensity of the campaign as the sea battle altered the distribution and movement of armed forces around their islands. As dawn approached on July 6th, Both navies prepared for the transition from night surface combat to air operations. American commanders expected that Japanese aircraft, from bases such as Kahili or Balale, might be dispatched once reports of the engagement reached higher headquarters. Japanese staff, in turn, anticipated that Allied aircraft from Guadalcanal and the Russells would search for damaged or stranded ships. This expectation shaped immediate decisions. American destroyers planned to clear the area after rescue efforts, while Japanese captains considered whether to remain near grounded or damaged units or to withdraw beyond likely search patterns. In numerical terms, the peak of the Battle of Kula Gulf produced contrasting outcomes. The Japanese had lost at least one modern destroyer, Niizuki, with several hundred casualties, and had a second vessel stranded and at risk near New Georgia. However, they succeeded in landing over 1,000 troops and a portion of their supplies at Kolombangara. The United States lost one light cruiser, Helena, with more than 150 personnel killed or missing and several hundred awaiting rescue or already recovered. Other American ships sustained no significant damage. These results, achieved in a few hours of night combat, represented a concentrated exchange of ships and personnel within the broader campaign for the Central Solomons. In the hours and days after the battle, both navies adjusted their behavior to the new conditions imposed by the fighting in Kula Gulf. For the United States, the immediate form of resistance was the effort to recover Helena survivors under the continued threat of enemy action. Nicholas and Radford, having already embarked several hundred men, made repeated passes through areas of floating debris before withdrawing at dawn to reduce the risk from air attack. Recognizing that many sailors remained adrift, American commanders organized subsequent nocturnal searches using destroyers and smaller craft, combining radar sweeps with Coast Watch reports and estimated drift patterns. Survivors themselves adapted to the environment using improvised methods. Groups on rafts or nets rationed emergency rations, organized watches, and attempted to steer toward Vela La Vela or other land masses using makeshift paddles or by exploiting currents. Some men reached Vela La Vela after many hours in the water, where they made contact with local inhabitants and Allied coast watchers. These personnel helped conceal and feed them, and facilitated later extraction by small boats and, in some cases, by aircraft or additional naval units. The cooperation between naval survivors, coast watchers, and islanders represented a form of dispersed resistance to the risks posed by isolation and enemy patrols. Within Task Group 36.1 and the wider South Pacific Command, staff officers examined the engagement to identify tactical lessons. One conclusion was that prolonged straight course runs at night in confined waters increased exposure to long-range torpedoes. Recommendations emphasized more frequent course changes during night engagements and better coordination between radar information and maneuver orders. The heavy reliance on gunfire to the relative neglect of American torpedo employment was also noted. In later actions, destroyer commanders were encouraged to launch torpedoes earlier rather than reserving them until visual confirmation of enemy dispositions. On the Japanese side, the reinforcement system itself demonstrated a capacity for adaptation. Despite the loss of Niizuki and the stranding of Nagatsuki, a significant portion of the embarked troops and supplies from the convoy reached Kolombangara. Barge units and small craft continued to move personnel from Kolombangara toward New Georgia, shifting routes and schedules in response to increased Allied air reconnaissance and naval sweeps. Japanese officers responsible for transport operations experimented with dispersing departures and arrivals to reduce the chance of concentrated interception, accepting longer transit times as the cost of increased survivability. Japanese destroyer crews incorporated their experience from Kula Gulf into ongoing night fighting practice. Reports emphasized the effectiveness of coordinated torpedo salvos even under heavy gunfire, but they also acknowledged the vulnerability of command ships once detected by radar-directed batteries. Some recommendations called for shorter exposure times within expected enemy radar coverage zones, more frequent use of smoke, and greater decentralization of torpedo firing authority, so that individual ships could exploit fleeting opportunities without waiting for complex maneuver orders. Morale on both sides responded in nuanced ways. Among American sailors, knowledge that Helena had been lost produced a sense of material and personal cost, particularly among crews that had trained or served alongside her officers and men. At the same time, the partial success of rescue operations and the survival of many crew members provided a basis for confidence in damage control and recovery procedures. Japanese sailors and soldiers involved in the convoy perceived the outcome as mixed. On one hand, a destroyer and many comrades had been lost. On the other, the majority of the transported troops had reached their destination and would contribute to the defense of the Central Solomons. Resource management became more stringent after the battle. The United States Navy in the South Pacific reassessed the allocation of cruisers to night actions in narrow waters, taking into account the cumulative risk from torpedoes and mines. There was increased emphasis on integrating air power with surface operations, using reconnaissance and attack aircraft to reduce the number of enemy destroyers required to be engaged at close range. Japanese planners, facing finite numbers of modern destroyers and mounting fuel constraints, weighed the continued use of such ships as transports against alternative methods such as increased barge traffic and the development of additional forward facilities. Psychologically, the experience of Kula Gulf influenced how individual commanders and crews approached subsequent engagements. American officers became more cautious about closing to short ranges purely to improve gunnery solutions, aware that unseen torpedoes might already be running. Japanese commanders, while retaining confidence in night fighting doctrine, had direct evidence that Allied radar and rapid-fire cruisers could inflict serious damage before torpedo results became visible. This mutual recognition shaped a pattern of adaptation in which each side sought to maintain initiative while reducing exposure, setting conditions for the further night battles that would follow in the Central Solomons during July and August 1943. In the weeks after the Battle of Kula Gulf, the cumulative effects of repeated night engagements in the Central Solomons began to alter the direction of the campaign. For American planners, the loss of Helena in exchange for one Japanese destroyer and a partially interrupted reinforcement run highlighted a discrepancy between tactical risk and operational gain. Destroyer and cruiser commanders reported that even when radar-directed gunfire achieved rapid hits, long-range torpedoes could still inflict serious damage on ships maintaining steady courses in restricted waters. This assessment did not end surface sweeps, but it influenced how and where they would be used. A further indication of this shift came on the night of 12th to 13th July 1943 in the Battle of Kula Gulf. There, another Allied cruiser-destroyer force attempting to intercept a Japanese reinforcement convoy engaged a formation centered on the light cruiser Jinsu. During the battle, Jinsu was sunk with heavy casualties, but Japanese destroyers again launched coordinated salvos of Type 93 torpedoes. Several Allied cruisers, including Honolulu, St. Louis, and the New Zealand cruiser Leander, were hit and damaged. Japanese transports succeeded in landing additional troops on Kula Gulf, while both sides added new ships and personnel to their lists of losses and damaged units. These outcomes, when combined with those from Kula Gulf, marked a turning point in American operational thinking. Staff at South Pacific headquarters concluded that direct attempts to prevent every Japanese reinforcement by sending cruiser-centered groups into the narrow waters off Kula Gulf exposed valuable ships to disproportionate torpedo risk. They began to place greater emphasis on air interdiction, destroyer torpedo attacks from more flexible formations, and the use of landings that would bypass heavily defended positions rather than confronting them frontally. The decision to focus on Vela La Vela, north of Kula Gulf, for the next set of landings reflected this revised approach. For the Japanese command, the same series of battles produced a different but related inflection. The Kula Gulf convoy and subsequent runs had delivered several thousand troops and significant quantities of supplies to Kula Gulf, strengthening the local garrison. However, reports from destroyer flotilla leaders documented the increasing attrition of modern ships, the pressure on fuel stocks, and the growing difficulty of operating under Allied air reconnaissance by day and radar-equipped surface forces by night. The cost of each successful reinforcement mission, measured in damaged or lost destroyers and experienced personnel, rose with every engagement. As a result, Japanese planners in Rabaul and Tokyo gradually adjusted their expectations. Instead of viewing New Georgia and Kolombangara as positions that could be held indefinitely, they began to treat them as delaying points intended to slow the Allied advance and buy time for the consolidation of more northerly bases. The reinforcement missions, including the one that had fought its way through Kula Gulf, were reinterpreted as measures to sustain a fighting withdrawal rather than as steps toward restoring the earlier forward defensive line. The populations of the Central Solomons experienced this turning point through changes in the pattern of military presence and activity. On Kolombangara, the influx of Japanese troops following the July convoys increased demands for food, labor, and accommodation, while also drawing in more Allied air attacks and naval bombardments. On islands such as Vella La Vella, the prospect of future landings by either side became more concrete as both navies surveyed anchorages and beaches suitable for operations beyond Kolombangara. Local communities were called upon more frequently to provide guides, canoes, and information, integrating them further into a conflict whose strategic logic was set far from their shores. Within the Allied naval forces, tactical orders changed in ways that reflected the lessons of Kula Gulf. Destroyer captains received revised instructions to employ torpedoes earlier in engagements and to execute more frequent course alterations when operating within likely torpedo range. Cruiser deployments were reviewed to ensure that their use in narrow waters corresponded to clearly defined operational objectives, such as covering landings or bombarding specific targets, rather than general interception, sweeps alone. Training programs highlighted the need to integrate radar information with maneuver and to anticipate enemy torpedo doctrine, rather than reacting only after hits were observed. Japanese destroyer flotillas, while continuing to conduct Tokyo Express runs, also modified their procedures. Greater use was made of dispersed routes and staggered departure times to complicate Allied interception. Some convoys were structured with increased reliance on barges and smaller craft for the final legs of the journey, reducing the time that destroyers needed to spend within range of Allied surface groups. Night fighting drills incorporated scenarios in which command ships might be quickly disabled, requiring subordinate captains to act on partial information. The combination of these adaptations on both sides signaled that the series of actions beginning with Kula Gulf had shifted the momentum of the campaign from an attempt to contest every island and sea lane directly toward a pattern of selective advance and calculated delay. The Japanese presence on Kolombangara remained, reinforced by the very convoys that had fought through American interception, but the strategic value of holding that island at high naval cost was being reconsidered. For the Allies, the recognition that they could achieve progress by outflanking strongpoints rather than by repeated cruiser-destroyer battles in narrow gulfs marked a functional turning point in the conduct of operations in the Central Solomons. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, withdrawal and consolidation took priority for both commands. At sea, Ainsworth's remaining cruisers and destroyers cleared Kula Gulf and New Georgia Sound before daylight, returning toward Tulagi and Purvis Bay. Damage reports were compiled en route, listing the loss of Helena, expenditure of ammunition, and the physical condition of crews after a night of continuous action and rescue work. Medical officers treated burns, shrapnel wounds, and exposure among the recovered survivors, while shipfitters and engineers inspected holes in machinery for any effects from near misses that might not have been apparent during the engagement. Further north, Japanese destroyers that had remained afloat after the battle steered back toward the Shortland Islands and Rabaul. Suzukaze and Tanikaze reported damage and ammunition expenditure, as well as the loss of Niyazuki and the presumed death of Rear Admiral Akiyama. Transport destroyers that had successfully disembarked troops near Vila completed their approach to northern bases once clear of likely Allied air search zones. Returning crews were debriefed about the effectiveness of torpedo salvos, the intensity of American gunfire, and the challenges of navigation and formation, keeping in Kula Gulf. On the New Georgia coast, Nagatsuki lay stranded in shallow water near Bairoko. Her crew offloaded remaining ammunition, provisions, and portable equipment, transferring much of it to shore under cover of darkness. Personnel were marched inland to join nearby Japanese army units, or concentrated for later evacuation by barges. Preparations were made to deny the abandoned destroyer to the enemy. Demolition charges were emplaced, and plans were formed to call for airstrikes once daylight allowed accurate targeting by friendly aircraft. The grounded hull thus became a fixed point, around which both sides' planning for the following day would revolve. At dawn on the 6th of July, aircraft entered the scene in strength. United States Army Air Forces and Navy squadrons from Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands conducted searches over Kula Gulf and the surrounding waters. Pilots sighted wreckage, oil slicks, and the stranded Nagatsuki, reporting positions to their commands. Attacks were flown against the grounded destroyer, adding bomb and strafing damage to the effects of grounding and demolition. Japanese aircraft from northern bases, in turn, attempted to locate and strike Allied ships thought to be in the area, but by the time many reached the Gulf, Ainsworth's main force had already cleared the Central Solomons approaches. For Helena survivors who had not yet been recovered, the withdrawal of large Allied ships meant that subsequent rescue depended on smaller units and on cooperation with local inhabitants. Over the next days, American destroyers, fast transports, and motor torpedo boats conducted targeted search operations during darkness, guided by Coast Watch signals and by estimates of drift from the original sinking position. Several groups of survivors were evacuated from Vella La Vella, where they had been sheltered by islanders and Coast Watch personnel. These operations required careful timing to avoid Japanese patrols and air reconnaissance, and they represented a continuation of the battle in the form of contested access to the sea lanes used for extraction. On land, the immediate consequences of the engagement were felt in the tempo of the New Georgia campaign. Japanese troops landed from the Kula Gulf convoy were integrated into units responsible for the defense of Bairoko and the approaches to Munda. Their presence helped stiffen resistance along key tracks and defensive lines, delaying American advances. Conversely, the knowledge within Allied headquarters that a significant reinforcement had reached the area influenced assessments of required troop strength, artillery support, and air effort for subsequent operations against Munda and its supporting positions. Civilians and local communities faced the direct material aftermath of the battle. Wreckage from ships, including pieces of hull plating, crates, and personal equipment, washed ashore on New Georgia, Kolombangara, and Vella La Vella. Some of this material was collected and reused, some was reported to Allied or Japanese authorities, and some remained along beaches as physical traces of the engagement. Fishing patterns and coastal travel were affected by the presence of oil and debris, and by heightened military activity as both sides increased patrols and established new observation posts. In casualty terms, Kula Gulf produced a concentrated impact. The United States lost one light cruiser, with losses among officers and enlisted men that affected not only the ship itself, but also the specialized experience accumulated in her crew. Japanese naval forces lost a modern destroyer and suffered dead and wounded across several other ships, along with subsequent losses on the grounded Nagatsuki. Additional casualties occurred among troops embarked for transport and among personnel on shore, installations struck during air follow-up operations. These figures were recorded in separate national reporting systems, but together they marked the battle as a significant, if localized, cost within the wider Solomon Islands campaign. Administrative and doctrinal responses formed part of the withdrawal phase. In American commands, formal after-action reports were compiled, incorporating radar plots, gunnery logs, and survivor testimonies. These documents circulated to other fleet units and training commands, shaping revisions to night fighting instructions. Japanese staff at 8th Fleet and higher headquarters likewise collected reports from surviving captains and staff officers to refine their understanding of Allied radar capabilities and gunnery patterns. The process of analyzing Kula Gulf thus extended the battle beyond the night of July the 5th to 6th, translating immediate experiences into institutional memory. By the time surface activities in the immediate area returned to routine patrols and convoy passages, the Battle of Kula Gulf had left a pattern of altered deployments, wrecks in shallow water, and dispersed survivors. Both navies had withdrawn their main forces from direct contact, but the consequences of their brief encounter continued to shape operations, logistics, and local conditions throughout the Central Solomons. In later assessments of the Solomon Islands campaign, the Battle of Kula Gulf appeared as one element in a chain of actions that collectively reshaped operations in the Central Pacific At the immediate operational level, the engagement confirmed that Japanese forces could still move significant troop contingents by destroyer despite Allied surface and air pressure. Approximately 1,300 to 1,500 soldiers reached Kolombangara from Akiyama's convoy and subsequent runs, reinforcing positions that opposed American advances on New Georgia. At the same time, the loss of Helena and Niizuki and damage to other ships illustrated the cost paid by both navies when modern cruisers and destroyers fought at close quarters in confined waters. Strategically, the battle contributed to a gradual shift in Allied planning. The combined results of Kula Gulf and later July engagements demonstrated that attempting to block every Japanese reinforcement by cruiser-led surface interceptions was not the most efficient way to advance toward Rabaul. Instead, Allied commands increasingly emphasized bypass operations, landings on less defended islands such as Vella La Vella, and systematic use of air power to erode Japanese capacity to supply forward bases. In this sense, Kula Gulf formed part of the experience base that underpinned the move away from direct assaults on each strongpoint toward a pattern of encirclement and isolation. For Japan, the battle fed into a reassessment of how long positions in the Central Solomons could be held. Reinforcements delivered through Kula Gulf and similar operations temporarily strengthened the defense of Kolombangara and New Georgia, but destroyer flotilla reports detailing ship losses, fuel usage, and crew fatigue made clear that such reinforcement could not continue indefinitely at the same intensity. Over time, staff officers increasingly framed these islands as delaying zones rather than permanent bastions. When Japanese forces later evacuated Kolombangara and shifted northward, the earlier reinforcement effort was reinterpreted as part of a managed withdrawal, aimed at buying time for more northerly defenses. The battle also influenced naval doctrine more broadly. For the United States, after-action analyses highlighted both the strengths and limitations of radar-directed gunnery. Helena and the other light cruisers had demonstrated that concentrated 6-inch fire could quickly disable a radar-located target, yet the ship was lost to torpedoes launched beyond visual range. Subsequent tactical publications stressed frequent course changes within expected torpedo envelopes, better integration of destroyer torpedoes into initial battle plans, and closer coordination between surface units and supporting aircraft. These adjustments would inform later operations not only in the Solomons but in other archipelagos where night actions in confined waters were likely. Japanese doctrine, already oriented toward night torpedo attacks, drew further validation for the effectiveness of Type 93 salvos when correctly positioned. At the same time, the sinking of Niizuki under heavy radar guided fire underscored vulnerabilities in command arrangements that concentrated responsibility in a single flagship. Recommendations for greater decentralization of torpedo firing decisions and for reduced exposure of command ships reflected an attempt to preserve the benefits of night fighting tactics, while limiting the risk of sudden loss of control in the face of radar-equipped opponents. On the human level, the memory of Kula Gulf persisted among participants and local populations. For Helena survivors and the crews of Nicholas, Radford, and other rescuing ships, the combination of night combat, sinking, and extended periods in the water became a reference point in later personal accounts and unit histories. Japanese sailors who served on the destroyers involved, including men from the transport divisions and from Niizuki before her loss, similarly carried forward memories of fighting under gunfire while launching torpedoes and maneuvering among grounded or damaged ships. Solomon Islanders who assisted survivors or witnessed wrecks and air attacks incorporated these events into local narratives of the war. In historical writing after 1945, Kula Gulf has often been examined alongside other Central Solomons engagements rather than as an isolated event. Researchers have used ship logs, action reports, and survivor testimonies from both sides to reconstruct the sequence of movements, torpedo launches, and rescue efforts. The battle is frequently cited in discussions of night surface warfare, the interaction between radar and torpedo tactics, and the operational logic of the Solomon Islands campaign. Comparisons between American and Japanese sources have allowed historians to trace how differing perceptions during the action influenced decisions and how later interpretations evolved as more documentation became available. The physical legacy of the battle remained visible for years. The grounded hulk of Nagatsuki and other wreckage in Kula Gulf and nearby waters became navigational reference points and, later, sites of interest for divers and researchers. Oil traces, scattered debris, and occasional unexploded ordnance affected coastal areas where local communities lived and worked. Over time, as vegetation reclaimed shorelines and hulls corroded, these remains shifted from being immediate reminders of combat to being historical artifacts embedded in the maritime landscape. Politically and culturally, the engagement contributed in a modest but distinct way to national narratives of the Pacific War. In the United States, the loss of Helena and the extensive rescue of her crew were incorporated into broader accounts of sacrifice and persistence in the drive across the Pacific. In Japan, the actions of destroyer crews who carried out reinforcement missions under fire were used in some post-war depictions to illustrate discipline and adherence to duty. In the Solomon Islands, memories of cooperation between islanders, coast watchers, and naval personnel became part of local histories of wartime disruption and adaptation. Taken together, these strands give the Battle of Kula Gulf a legacy that extends beyond the immediate exchange of one cruiser and one destroyer and the landing of several thousand troops. The engagement influenced operational choices in the Central Solomons, shaped tactical doctrine on both sides, left enduring traces in the environment, and entered the recollections of those who experienced it directly or indirectly. Within the larger framework of the Pacific War, it stands as an example of how a single night action, fought in restricted waters between relatively small forces, could exert effects on planning, practice, and memory that reached well beyond the limits of the Gulf in which it occurred.